Good morning. Good morning. This video is on Exodus and Number on the biblical account. The Bible is a great source of event and historical accounts. There is a dispute the dispute about Abraham and Moses' life account that needed to be looked at. The account of Moses is an important historical record for Christians and Jews alike. Without this important consideration, the truth about Abraham and Moses remain hidden. The effort and the purpose of this video is to use a logical assessment, a basic logic, to assess the whereabouts of the Canaanite territory. So this video will only assess the possible route of which Moses took, not Abraham, which Moses took. The Bible gives us many important information. It's a source of historical records. It has an elaborated landscape account and explained geographical markings. It talks about historical cultures that exist during that time, the different routes using markers, how Moses traveled from Egypt into Canaanite territory. It also tells us the size of the population that were there, that left Egypt while they went toward the Canaan territory. We're going to start by reading Exodus chapter 12, verse 13. Exodus says, "And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramsey to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, beside women and children. According to this passage, men descended from Yaakov, that is from Egypt, a location called Yaakov. And Exodus chapter 7 says, Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. This gives us a 6,000 starting point to assess the population that left Egypt. And the next scripture we're going to use is Exodus chapter 7, verse 7. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. These two scriptures can give us the number of people that left Egypt. We're going to start by saying there were 600 men. The age of Moses is important because when Moses was born, children was required to be killed. We're going to assess then Moses' age is important to us because we're going to use his age as a boundary to decipher when Pharaoh did what. So during Moses' time, when Moses was born, children was required to be killed. So young children were supposed to be killed. So when did that start? In Numbers, it tells us that they were counting people that were of military age. And they say that they counted anybody between the age of 20 and more. So when Moses left, there were people in their 20s. So if there were people in their 20s, then what happened to them? Nothing. I was 80 years old when he left, when he went to talk to Pharaoh. It has been 80 years since the last time Pharaoh asked children to be killed. How long did that last? How many years did he end up killing children? And when did that stop? Or was it just a one-year event? So in Numbers, it also tells us that there were 20 years old that were counted. It says, there were men counted from Moses and Aaron and the 12 leaders of Israel, each one representing his family. All the Israelites, 20 years and more, who were able to serve in Israel army were counted according to their family. So 20 years old. That also comes into account when we count how many people left Israel. Were they 20 years old? Yes, they were 20 years old. If we can say they were 20 years old at that time, then that means the killing has stopped at some point. After the first 30 years or so, the killing stopped. Or after, actually, it could go all the way to 40-year old and then they stopped. So there were children, young children that are male at during when they exited Egypt. So we're going to assume there are 6,000 men of age. When we said of age, since they also counted using the military, so we're going to say starting at 20 years old. With that assessment, we're going to start considering everything. So let's start considering the first. So we're gonna say, let's say there are the same amount of women, because women were not killed. A lot of women were not killed when the men were being killed. So there should be a larger number of women, but we're just gonna say the same amount of women existed as that of a man. So there are 6,000 women that existed during that time, which would be of a marriage age within the same marriage group. So 1 for 1, we can just double that number and say that, which will give us 1,200,000, the population, just the same ratio of men to women, with 1 to 1. So within the same group, there could be more women, but there could be less women. But this is an assumption saying there is per marriage. There are some of them would be married, some of them are not, single women. Either way, we're gonna put 1 to 1 ratio and say there was an additional 600,000 and giving it to women. And then we're gonna assess also the children. But we're gonna assess the children saying that 1/3 of them is the only one that got married. 2/3 of them was married, 1/3 of them were not married. If we say that, and half of them had 1 child, and half of them had 2 children. So with that assumption, we're going to end up with the number 1,800,000. And then we're going to say they were also elderly, where 2/3 of them did not do well. So let's assume that 2/3 of them do not do well, meaning that they were killed by the Pharaoh because they stopped working, they were not doing a good job, and for many other reasons, they did not live long enough, that we can leave them at 200,000. And that number will give us an approximately 2 million people. So the assumption, with the various assumptions, that there were approximately 2 million people that left Egypt is a probable number. That's a possible number. We're going to leave it as a possible number, that there cannot be 1 million people that left, because men that are of military age being 6,000 and the rest of the elderly, the children, everything else being 400,000 does not make sense. So a 10 million is a probable and a possible number that left Egypt. I would like to emphasize too that Abraham's son Esau also, when Esau came, when Esau came with his family, his number was large. And his children also remarried. A lot of events happened. At that time, we have to assume, remember that men were allowed to marry more than one wife. So the assumption that there is more than one wife would have let the population grow larger. And on top of that, this only stopped when Pharaoh started putting pressure on the Egyptians, start converting them into slaves. So Ramses the second was the first reason why this becomes. So Ramses the second was the first reason. Okay. So Ramses the second was the reason why the Israelite population started decreasing. So when we assume 1:1 ratio for the female, it is because we can say that they could not, they were slaves and they cannot have more than one wife. If this ratio of 1:1 would have been much larger, if we are assuming that they would have had the same family number as Esau. So we're gonna use the minimum amount. Esau alone has his own. He had Joseph's brothers were large. We haven't accounted for his sisters, but his brothers were large. So then the family number was large. So their own family was large. So if we account it in that terms, this 2 million is so small. So it's a reasonable number to accept. We can also calculate similar outcome using the number, the number of military age Israelites during that time. We can come up with the same minimum amount of people that could have exited. So that's the 2 million is the most reasonable number of people. That's the smallest amount we can put on them. So saying anything less than that makes no sense. And we can also put a limit to when we calculate through using this assumption, the number assumption, the military age. We can also assume that when the military age ended, at what age does the military age ended? We were given another scripture that tells us when the Levi service age ended. In Number chapter 8 tells us this applies to the Levite. Men 25 years old or more shall come to be part of the work at the tent of the meeting, but at the age of 50 they must retire from the regular services and work no longer. So the age 50 tells us that they no longer need to be serviced. They cannot, their services end. So similarly, there is an age limit to what the military age is. Since we say that Moses is in his 80 and he's leading his people, but however, the military age, we cannot give him that to make him an 80 years old. It could be 80 years old. So anywhere between 80 to 60 is acceptable age. Since even though Moses is the leader, the Levite, the priest Levite was supposed to stop working at the age of 50. So we cannot really use Moses to that extent either. So 60 is a reasonable age. Using the 60 to 20 gap, the 20 for military services, we can calculate similar outcome for the minimum amount of people. Okay, we're going to move to the birth of Moses. And on Exodus chapter 2 through 10, we're just going to read the first four verses. It says, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she put a papyri basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it amongst the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Her sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. That was 80 years prior to that event, when Moses was born, where his mother, where all male was supposed to be killed and his mother did not. And he ended up being adopted by a Pharaoh daughter. And we're just going to read verse 5 that says, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She stopped it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew baby, she said. And it went on, and then she ended up adopting him, and her name was Betha. And he became an Egyptian royal. And the person that was king during the Moses' time was Ramses II. He ruled from 1304 to 1237. So he was candidate for the likely king during the Moses' time. Now we're going to use the map to analyze what transpired. So, we're going to start by assessing Egypt and Egypt's territory. So as of right now, this is Egypt and this is Egypt's territory. The whole event that took place about Moses happened right here. This is Exodus. As far as Exodus is concerned, this is where Moses journeyed. This is where he spent most of his time during Exodus time. So you might think he spent somewhere here, but that's not the event. This is not where the event took place. This is the only event that took place. I used to think this was the event that took place, but this is not really what happened. So this is Egypt, and we're going to start by assessing what's current today's Egypt territory. So we're going to get a closer look at what Egypt's territory today is. Sorry. Okay, we're going to continue. We're going to assess by a closer look at what Egypt's territory today is. As you can see, Egypt's territory lies right next to Israel. So this is Egypt's border. We put a different color. You can go ahead and see it properly. This is Egypt's border. on this side, right here on this side, lies Israel. On this side lies Egypt. So the east side is Israel, the west side is Egypt. So Egypt's territory is much larger than we can assume. It's bordered by the sea right here, and it goes right here. And so forth. So we are more or less interested in the area right here, because this is the pyramid, where the current pyramid, the pyramid of Ramses II found. So this is the Upper Egypt. This is where it is. This is Cairo. You want a different look at the map, you can go ahead and look at it with a different image. So here it is. Okay, we're going to continue. We're going to continue to assess where Egypt would have been. This is the Egyptian territory. As you can see, the borderline for Egypt and Israel that was set right here. And if you want, I can even give you a picture of how the Israelite border image was like. This is the actual border of the Israelites built, as you can see. It is a long line that goes like this. Let's see, that goes across the desert. You can see it right here. These are the building that separate Egypt and Israel. This is what I found. I found this image on the internet. I did not take this picture myself, so I have never been there to see it myself, so I cannot per se say this is the accurate image, but this is what is posted on the internet as the boundary that was set between Israel and so we're going back to the other image. We're going to go back and see that the boundary of Israel and the boundary of the current Israel and the current Egypt actually line up with each other. So they're just practically neighbors, next door neighbors. Right here. And this area is Egypt. Area is Egypt. On the last one, I keep saying Israel, so I have to re-record this tape. Here is the Egyptian territory. Egypt in olden time during Ramses II was divided into two portions, the Upper and Lower Egypt, which was called the Upper and Lower Egypt. The most likely area where the Israelites lived was right next to the pyramid, since the pyramid being right here, pyramid being, this is where the pyramid was, this area right here is where the pyramid, the Ramses II's pyramids, or the three pyramids are currently in the current map. So if that is the area where the royalty, most of the kings and Ramses and most of the Egyptians settled around the Nile, near the Nile, because fresh water was very important. And with fresh water and drinking water was very important. They lived near the upper Nile, closer to the upper Egypt, closer to the Nile. So the lower section of the Egypt was settled by Israel. So it's in the outer area of the Egyptian, wherever the Egyptians are, the outer area, and the lower area where there was water. So we can practically assume the lower area being somewhere here, and a cluster closer to the water, a clustered closer to the water, they would have settled. And if the assumption that they might have been farther out here would say that without water will make it very difficult. They have to live next to the water. And most of the waters around here are obtained by well. They do a lot of water wells to find water around the desert. So the farther we go that direction, the farther we get into a Sahara Desert. And Sahara Desert during Ramsey time already existed. Sahara Desert was believed to be somewhere between 5,000 and more to 11,000. Some of them even appraised at 13,000 years old when it was last fertile land with a whole lot of lake and vegetation. So this gives us the area of what Egyptian settlement look like anywhere near around the water. So with that assessment, did the Moses's journeys right here, whom did that territory belong to? And has it ever been, who owned it? There were at one time where the Assyrian occupied most of Egypt and several sections of the Asian territory, somewhere in as far, even somewhere, some part of Iraq and other areas. During that time, they also occupied Egypt. That was the case in Egypt at one point or another belonged to the Assyrian. But beside the Assyrian, this territory where Moses spent 40 years and the Israelites spent 40 years wandering has never been contested to belong to anybody else but the Egyptian. So it is assumed that the Egyptian owned that territory. If that is the case, then the Israelites contest, the contest that Moses has never left Egypt makes it very difficult if that territory has always been Egyptians, and if that territory was ever owned by anybody. And in that case, a little portion of Israel today has at one time or another belonged to Israelite during that time, during Ramses second time. If that's the case, then they settled in partial Israelite and the Egyptian territory. The Israelites settled in partial Egyptian territory, which contests. So where is the old Israel? Where could it have been? So if they left Israel, we should be looking farther out, away from the current Israel and the current area. So it has to be farther out into Asia, farther out into Saudi Arabia, farther down to Saudi Arabia, even heading toward India. If they exited from through another gate, we can look at another map and assess it using the other map. So open. We can look at, we can use this map and see where Egypt is. So if we said they moved farther up, so it will be farther into Iraq, it will be farther into Iraq or Syria, heading up to Syria, to Georgia, to Turkey, to Iran, or even Saudi Arabia. Those are the possible areas. Iraq and Iran could be somewhere in Iraq or Iran. It could be in Turkey. So Israel, the actual Israel could be further up. So these are the possible areas we could look at. So if we said it's somewhere either in Iraq or Iran, or in Turkey or in Saudi Arabia. If not, then we can go ahead and say it could be, if they have to leave Egypt, then it could be in Sudan, it could be into Libya, it could be heading into Chad, it could be heading into Eritrea, or it could be heading into Central Africa. We have to assume that they stuck around within the water area. So we can go ahead and say, we can assume that any of mountainous area could account to the Mount Sinai. So if there is a mountainous region, possible mountainous region that could be found, and that could meet a certain locations, then Mount Sinai could be found within this area. Somewhere within this area, Mount Sinai could be accounted within this area, within this area, within this area, within this area. Even if they stick if they stick around the river, there are plenty of rivers that could account these areas. So Mount Sinai, they reached Mount Sinai without ever needing to drink water. So if they have, if there is a body of water around here, that could account for Mount Sinai. Okay, if you want a different look at this is a different look at the map. So as you can see, the pyramid is somewhere around here. This is the pyramid, and this is the line for Egypt, borderline, the border for Egypt, and borderline for it. So see, this is Israel on the east side, and the west side is Egypt. And to make matters even more interesting, Moses' Exodus event took place right inside Egypt, the current Egypt territory, right here. This is the area. So this is where the Israelites wandered in the wilderness and ended up being a neighbor to Egypt. So as you can see, so the whole thing about Moses event took place right here. So if this is the area that was Moses's, this is the area where the pyramid they were building. So we can properly assume where the Israelites was located. So we can hear this was their most likely area where they lived. Moses's basket was most likely sent across the Nile. So this is the Nile. This is where most likely where he was found, drifting upward, heading north, because the current on the Nile River drifts north. So he was drifting north into wherever the palace is, where she discovered him. So if that is the case, then where were the Israelites settled? If this is the upper Egypt, then they were settled at the lower Egypt. So we can approximate the lower Egypt to be somewhere here. And they commute or they live outside. They commute or they live outside of the border. And they usually most likely lived in cluster near or around the water. So if the assumption that they could have been living around here makes it difficult because it's farther away from the water. in order to survive, fresh water was necessary. So people live in cluster near around a water, drinking water. That the upper and lower Egypt, there is an this is the upper and lower Egypt. Upper, lower. There's the upper and lower Egypt. They might have headed toward the lower Egypt. That's one possibility. They migrated along the line of along this line. So we can assume they were headed down this way. Another assumption is that way. Another assumption is that way. Since we know that they could, sorry. I'm gonna put it that way. So this one goes this way. So these two, the assumption of this one is possible, the possible scenario that could have happened, but this is not. This line right here is not possible scenario because it's towards the desert and there's no water to follow. So we have to assume that they followed a water line. So there could have been a water line they could have followed around here. This is a possible scenario where they could have followed a water line. This is a possible scenario they could have followed a water line because of the Nile. And as to the Asian trip, there is a whole lot of water line they could have followed. So any one of the Asian line is a possible scenario. So Israel could be anywhere out there in Asia. Lost it somewhere in Asia. Or Israel could have been lost in toward the central, toward Israel could be somewhere in Central Africa or further Southeast Africa or Asia. So those are the most likely scenarios that could have taken place. They followed a water line and followed a water. So with a similar assumption, so that means somewhere one of this mountain is Mount Sinai. One of the mountain on that line is Mount Sinai because they reached Mount Sinai without the need for water to drink. And after they reached Mount Sinai, they wandered into a wilderness and they went ahead and the need for water and food arose. So these are some of the possible scenarios. This will take them also towards Sahara Desert. If they wander towards Central Africa, that would give them toward that would lead them towards the Sahara Desert. Also, if they went further, and they ended up going north again. And any one of them would lead them to a desert areas and water areas. So any of this is a possible scenario that explains, but the current location of Israel does not make sense because it's just borders too much on Egypt, and that territory has never been claimed by anybody else but Egypt. If that's the case, then what happened? So I'm going to end up the recording right here. Okay.